The Adepta Sororitas, more commonly known in the Imperium as the Sisters of Battle, are warriors of righteous zeal and unwavering faith. In this video we're going to show you 4 different ways to paint the armour of your Sisters of Battle miniatures, which will cover the 6 colour schemes of the Order Majoris seen in the Codex. So grab your paintbrushes and let's get started. The first armour colour we're going to be looking at is black, which will cover the orders of our Martyred Lady, Ebon Chalice and Valorous Heart. Now, to prepare our model for painting, we've already undercoated it here with Chaos Black spray, and the first thing we're going to do is apply a base coat of Abaddon Black all over the miniature. Now, first of all, before we use one of our paints, we're just going to give it a really good shake to make sure the paint's mixed up, and then let's get painting. For this, we're using our large base brush, and we're just going to take a little bit of paint out of the pot like so, onto our palette like this, a little bit more, and then we're going to mix a little bit of water in just to thin our paint down to help it go onto the model. Then, onto the miniature, we're just going to apply it nice and evenly all over the armour. Now, you might think it's strange why we're painting a black base coat over a black undercoat, but the reason is because Abaddon Black and Chaos Black are very slightly different tones. So if you make a mistake later on and want to correct it using the Abaddon Black paint, painting this black base coat first means your corrections will blend in much easier. And there we go, the base coat has dried on the model. So now it's time to start highlighting the armour, and for this we're going to be using 3 different paints. We're going to use Dark Reaper, Thunderhawk Blue and finally Ulthuan Grey to add line highlights to the edges of our power armour. For all of these paints we're going to be using our medium layer brush because it has a really nice point on it, which is added control for that highlighting. So let's get started. So first of all, we're going to take a little bit of paint out of the pot like so and add it onto our palette like this. We're going to add a little bit of water just in there to soften the paint down a little bit. That helps the highlights be a little bit more subtle when they're applied to the model, and also means the paint flows on the model a little easier. Then onto the miniature. Now, very carefully around the model, we're just going to apply line highlights around the edges of the power armour like so. You want to be going around the edges of all the lines of armour like this, and don't worry if this is quite a thick highlight. We're going to be adding other thinner highlights throughout. It's going to take you a little while to highlight your Sister of Battle models, but don't worry, take your time and get it as neat as you possibly can. Next up, we're applying a highlight of Thunderhawk Blue. Here, we're using very thin highlights just inside the highlight we put down previously. Again, take your time and be as neat as you possibly can. Last but not least, we're adding a very, very fine highlight of Ulthuan Grey in areas at the very edges of the armour. And with the final highlight applied, the black power armour is complete. So now we're going to be moving on to the red power armour of the Order of the Bloody Rose, and for this we've already undercoated our model here with Mephiston Red spray. And once that's dry, the first thing we're going to do is be applying a shade of Agrax Earthshade into the recesses of the armour. For this we want lots of control, so we're using a small layer brush. Let's get to it. Now here we're going to be taking a little bit of paint out of the pot like so and onto the palette. We're not going to thin this down, and the reason why is we want the paint to be nice and thick and have a strong pigment for the shades in the recesses. Onto the miniature then. We're going to be very carefully painting it into the recesses of the power armour. Now, be very careful here just to paint it into the recesses where the armour panels meet, like this. Be as neat as you possibly can. It's going to take you a little while to do the entire armour, but don't worry, that's perfectly normal. Just try and be as neat as you can. If you make a mistake and you go a bit blotchy, you can always go back with Mephiston Red paint in a pot and correct that. With the wash carefully applied into the recesses, it's time to move on to the next stage. And up next we're going to be applying a couple of highlights onto our power armour. First of all, Evil Sunz Scarlet and second, Fire Dragon Bright. Both of these will be applied with a small layer brush to get nice thin highlights on the armour. So let's get started. First of all, with the Evil Sunz Scarlet, we're just going to take a little bit of paint out of the pot like so, add it onto the palette. Here we are going to add a little bit of water just to thin our paint down to help those highlights go on a little bit more smoothly. Then onto the model, we're going to be very carefully painting Evil Sunz Scarlet onto the very edges of the power armour joints like this. You can see the power armour plate here has a nice edge there. It's going to paint around the edge like so. A nice line of Evil Sunz Scarlet. Go around the entire model and do all the edges of your power armour like this. Again, it will take a little time, but it's really worth putting the effort in here. Next up, we're applying a highlight of Fire Dragon Bright. This time again, we're using a really thin brush, a small layer brush, to add a small thin line of Fire Dragon Bright inside the highlights we've already applied. Again, we've watered this down a little bit to thin the paint, and take your time to make sure you're being as neat as you possibly can. And with the last highlight applied, the Order of the Bloody Rose's red armour is done. Up next is the white armour of the Order of the Sacred Rose, and for this we've already undercoated our model here with Corax White Spray. Once that's dry, we're going to be adding a layer of contrast paint, Apothecary White, all over the armour. Here we're going to be mixing up a little contrast medium to make it a little bit thinner, and we're going to be applying it with our medium shade brush. So let's get straight to it. First of all, we're going to take a little bit of contrast medium out of the pot like this. We're going to add about 2 brushes here. Perfect. Then we're going to wash our brush off and add 1 brush full of Apothecary White onto the palette like so to mix it around. There we go. Then, this mix we're going to add onto the model all over the white armour. We're going to add a quite thick coat here as well and just move the paint around to make sure it's not pooling in any areas at all. Allow about 30 minutes for the contrast paint to fully dry, and once it has, we move on to the next stage. So you can see the Apothecary White has dried on the armour, giving this really cool effect. Up next, it's time to highlight the armour, and for this we'll be using 2 separate whites. First of all, Corax White, and then White Scar. For both of these highlights, we'll be using our small layer brush for added control. So let's go for it. Let's take a bit of the Corax White out of the pot like so, and onto our palette. Again, we're going to be adding just a touch of water to thin it down here, not too much. Perfect. Then onto the model, we're going to be very carefully highlighting around the edges of the power armour here. So anywhere there was an edge, highlight it up here. You want quite a thick highlight here, it's going to be quite subtle. We're going to be adding the thinner White Scar highlight after this. Again, take your time with this. It's going to take a little bit of time to get the entire model highlighted up, but it's really worth spending your time and being as neat as you possibly can. And lastly, we're applying a highlight of White Scar onto the edges of the power armour. Here we want to be quite a light highlight, so nice and thin lines inside the highlights we just applied before. And with the final highlight applied, the white armour is done, and you're ready to paint the rest of the miniature. Up next, let's have a look at painting the bright silver armour of the Order of the Argent Shroud. For this, we've undercoated our model here with Leadbelcher spray, and the first thing we're going to do is apply a base coat of Iron Hand Steel all over the armour with a large base brush. So let's get to it. Now, as always, we're going to take a little bit of paint out of the pot like so, and put it onto our palette. We're going to add a touch of water, just here, not too much when we're using a metallic paint. There we go, perfect. Then we're going to apply it all over the armour of our model. So, nice even coat all over the armoured parts of our Sister of Battle. And there we go, we've applied the bright silver base coat with the Iron Hand Steel, and it's time to move on to the next stage. Up next, we're going to be applying a contrast paint all over the armour here, Basilicana and Grey mixed with contrast medium. For this, we're going to be using our medium shade brush, so let's get straight to it. Now, first of all, we're going to take a couple of brushfuls of contrast medium onto our palette like so. Just apply it there. Then we're going to wash our brush off in the water, and then apply 1 brushful of Basilicana and Grey and mix it in like that. Perfect. Then we're going to apply it onto the armour like so. Now, our contrast paint we're going to apply nice and heavily all over the armour like this. A nice thick coat, but just make sure as you're applying the paint you're moving it around so it doesn't pool or gather together in the recesses. Once it's been applied, allow about 20 minutes for it to fully dry, and we'll move on to the next stage. And you can see the Basilicana and Grey has dried all over the model, giving this really cool effect. We've also applied it to the bolt gun so we can paint it at the same time. Up next, we're going to be applying a couple of highlights onto the model. We're going to start off with a dry brush of Iron Hand Steel. Then we'll be applying a highlight of Stormhost Silver over the top of that. But first of all, it's that dry brush of Iron Hand Steel, and for this we're using our medium dry brush. So I'll take a little bit of paint out of the pot like so. And when dry brushing, we're going to be rubbing off most of the paint on the piece of tissue paper like so, just to make sure there's almost no paint left on the brush. There we go. Bingo. Then onto the model, we're going to apply a very light dry brush all over the silver armour like so. Just rubbing up and down gently, making sure we're picking out the raised areas on the armour and the bolt gun at the same time. Next up, we're applying a fine highlight of Stormhost Silver on the very edges of the armour plates. You want to be as neat as you possibly can here. This will take a little bit of time, but don't worry, it is worth the effort. And with the Stormhost Silver highlight applied, the silver armour of the Order of the Argent Shroud is complete. And that's 4 different ways to paint the armour on your Sisters of Battle miniatures. Hope you found this useful. Happy painting.